Today I'm here to talk to you about the novel We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Again, I'm terrible pronouncing names, so give me a break. Really interesting. This is a book that's been on my radar for a long time. It is often referred to as the grandfather of dystopian fiction. And we'll get into how it's influenced and kind of its legacy in that way. But I was inspired to get this recently because these beautiful penguin, what do they call them? Penguin Vitae editions. So I have a really gorgeous um, copy of this, and then I'll get it for you. One of my favorite novels, The Great Gatsby, they have an edition as well. Today's beer, we are doing a Dogfish Head Brewing, which is from Delaware, and we are doing the 60-minute IPA. So IPA is a little bit more hoppy, typically a little stronger. This one's not super strong, it's 6%, but still pretty good. So anyway, here's to our novel. Let's get into some dystopian goodness. We, written by Yevgeny Zamyatin. My copy was translated by Clarence Brown. I think is a pretty recent translation, a newer one. So if you're a translation nerd, this edition has like a really interesting introduction by Clarence Brown that goes really into the different translations and the translation history of this novel. So if you're one of those people who's like super interested, it's worth picking up. These aren't crazy expensive because it has a fascinating foreword by Masha Green or Masha Gessen. It talks about more like the legacy of the novel, how it's impacted dystopian fiction, those kinds of things. And then another introduction by Clarence Brown that really goes into the history of publication and translation around the world. Because this book has a pretty interesting history as far as translation and publication. And we'll get into some of that in a bit. So, summary. We is set in the future in a dystopian society that is called the One State. We follow a character called D503, who's an engineer. The One State is an urban nation. The way it's described is pretty much everything's made out of glass. Like the buildings are glass, the streets are glass, and it's see-through. It's like straight up, you're in your little apartment, and the person next to you can see what you're doing. Everyone can see what everyone's doing, which helps with supervision and mass surveillance. There's a daily march where everyone lines up and they march for like an hour and they just like listen to the One State anthem, that kind of society. So highly ordered, highly regimented, very little privacy, very little individuality. It's a society run strictly on logic, reason, and that's the justification for the laws and the systems that they have. Okay. So this is not a new government. We come into it a few hundred years after One State has basically it's the entire world. Our character D503 is working on a spaceship called the Integral, where they're going to use that to kind of probe and then conquer like extraterrestrial planets. The goal is to spread the harmony of the One State as far as they can spread it. And then what we are reading is the journal of D503 because the One State encourages people to basically kind of like time capsule stuff that your school maybe had you do when you were a kid. Same idea, like write things, create things. They'll put them on the probe, and that'll kind of serve as a record for when it gets to wherever it's going. And so D503 is writing this journal because he's really excited. I mean, he's one of the chief engineers of this project. And so we are introduced to him, the Bureau of Guardians, which are the group who watches everybody. He has a lover, O90, who's too short to have children, but they're together. And then his best friend, R13, who is also a lover of O90. The way it works is you like turn in tickets if you want to get down with somebody. And anyone can get down with whoever they want. It's like not a romantic thing. And so you just go and you like, I need a ticket for whoever, whatever their number is. You get assigned that ticket and then you show up on the designated day. You hand them the ticket and then the blinds go down so you guys get a little bit of privacy you do the deed, and then the blinds go up and you go home. And so, like I said, the fact that we have a little triangle with D503 R13, who is a state sponsored poet. And so, like, the one thing we see is he reads a verse about a public execution. And then 090 is like the third leg of that triangle. And basically, the action all kicks off when D503 meets a woman called I330. Sorry, I have to keep looking because I'm good with names, terrible when their names are just numbers. So I have to keep looking to make sure I get the numbers right. And then this I330 is the one who kind of instigates change in our main character, D503. So she smokes cigarettes, she drinks alcohol, she flirts with D503. She kind of is the corrupting factor. And then from there, things go the way dystopians always go. You're kind of exposed to the flaws in the system, and then our character grapples with their place in it and whether they want to buck the system or not, and then we end up where we end up. So I won't reveal everything that happens, because obviously one of the fun parts of these dystopians is reading it for yourself and finding out what all the rules are, how close is it to the society we currently live in, which is, we live in the darkest timeline, so it's always closer than we hope. So literary context. And really, this book stands on its own as like a really interesting dystopian, right, work. And it's one of the very early examples of a dystopian work. But we got to talk about what it's more known for, I think, and kind of unfairly, is the impact it then had on other works. And so George Orwell claimed that Aldous Huxley's Brave New World must be partly derived from We. He's like, no, there's no way. There are too many similarities. It has to have come from that. Huxley says that he wrote Brave New World as a reaction to H.G. Wells' Utopias long before he ever heard of the book We. So Huxley claims that there is no connection. He didn't read We or know about its existence before he wrote his book. Orwell is like, nah, there has to be connection there. Kurt Vonnegut said that in writing Player Piano, he cheerfully ripped off the plot of Brave New World, whose plot had been cheerfully ripped off from Zamyatin's We. So, even Vonnegut is making a joke about how he took from Huxley, and Huxley had to have taken from Zamyatin. And Ayn Rand's Anthem, significant similarities to We, although stylistically very different. Nabokov has a novel, Invitation to a Beheading, which has some similarities to We, and Nabokov has said he was reading We while he was writing that book, so it's very it's very possible that there are connections there. And then probably the big boy, the daddy of it all, is that Orwell began writing 1984, 8 months after he read a French translation of We, and wrote a review of it. Orwell is reported as saying he was taking it as the model for his next novel. It has been commented that reading We appears to have been the crucial literary experience for several of these authors in that time period who wrote what are arguably much more popular dystopian novels that we would all recognize. We're talking Huxley, Orwell, we have Vonnegut there. But basically, this is like the granddaddy of dystopian fiction. But I think one of the reasons it's not as popular, one is the publication history. Although it's been published in English for a long time, very interesting. So it was published in English in 1924. Zamyatin had a really hard time. He could not get it published in Russia or the Soviet Union. And he actually was exiled twice, once by the Tsarist regime, and then he returned after the Bolsheviks took control, and then again left in the 30s because he was an enemy of the state, basically. So it was not published in Russia until 1988, even though the novel was published in other places as early as 1921. But what got him in hot water was in 1927, a Czech language version was published, and I guess that was close enough to home that the Russian authorities were not very pleased. that those ideas and what he was saying could spread. Um, One of the things to say is that usually dystopians are pretty bleak, obviously. When we think of Orwell 1984 being like the quintessential dystopian book, it is pretty bleak. And so is We, especially the end. If you know anything about 1984, you might see a connection there. But there's also a lot of funny things in We, and I think he is poking some jokes. Kind of like one of those things that you have to laugh to keep from crying. And I don't think I got all the jokes, but I think they're certainly there. Zamyatin said it is both his most lighthearted and most serious novel, and I could see that being a true analysis of it. There's a lot of funny parts and a lot of what are supposed to be jokes mixed in with like this really depressing idea. If we look at the novel, there's a lot of connections to real world stuff, a little references. For example, he in the beginning of the novel has to go to Auditorium 112. And then at the end of the novel, he ends up in Auditorium 112, which is the number of the cells Zamyatin was imprisoned in twice. There are lots of literary allusions. So D503 is alluded to as Adam a couple times. I330 is Eve. There's a guardian who's, I think he's like S4711 or something. But he's always described as being shaped like an S, having a double bent body. Kind of represents the snake in the Garden of Eden. He is a double agent. And then the resistance group is called Mephi, which apparently is a allusion to Mephistopheles. And so there is some religious commentary you could make reading the novel. And one of the things that's been interesting, and if you read the introduction to this copy, and I'm sure probably Penguin Classics version too, is they talk about how one of the other reasons Zamyatin's We is not as popular is because what he envisioned as the dystopia is not as close or has turned out to be as accurate as some others. Where Zamyatin, he was an engineer, so he actually like designed boats, like ice breaking boats for Russia. And so he was a super mathematical guy, super logical guy, but he also saw that like humans having the ability to make mistakes and be passionate and do things and learn was one of the greatest parts of like human nature. And so for him, a dystopia is everyone being reduced to like a logical number and output, basically being a cog in a machine. In the novel, there are parts where there's an operation that comes out to literally remove your imagination from you. Um, Whereas in reality, we've seen in World War II and after that, and then throughout that, really these like kind of totalitarian, authoritarian states really rely on not logic as an argument, but appealing to the basest parts of human nature and encouraging people to act on those base instincts or encouraging those in a way that makes people feel good. It's cathartic. And so instead of this like up this perfectly logical ordered society where like they have a schedule down to the minute, and because there's no confusion, there's no room for mistakes, and people aren't unhappy. Instead, it's really like appealing to the worst parts of humanity to get us to do terrible things. Um, and so there's some idea that maybe that's why it's not as popular because it's a slightly different take on it. I don't know. It's still pretty compelling. He talks a lot about this guy Taylorism, which I guess at the time was very popular. He was um he this guy Taylor basically published all these things talking about industrial efficiency and like scheduling things down to the minute and all sorts of things. And then that got really popular in I guess the Bolshevik early Russia, and so they were implemented like his timetable and stuff. And so you have like in the book, there's a timetable like literally down to the minute what you're supposed to be doing at any given time of the day. It is interesting that his dystopia is a world where all passion and individuality and kind of the room to make mistakes and to like learn from those mistakes is totally wiped away in favor of like this uber logical, uber ordered society where the fact that you can't you don't want for anything and you also don't have any options kind of creates a false sense of happiness because you're not stressed out about anything. There are a lot of interesting ideas in the book. I think there's like an example where they talk about how they gave three numbers 30 days off and let them do whatever they wanted. And those people like just ended up going to where they would work anyway, and then like mining, doing carpentry because that was their jobs. And then it led to them like spiraling down. It's kind of crazy, but it makes me think about like a couple years ago hearing this study that kind of was like put out to argue against universal basic income because they were like, oh, people would just end up sitting around and doing nothing. And I think it's really interesting that even from like 1920 something to today, you have like these parallels in either how people act, or you could say like how we're dissuaded from having these things. Again, I don't want to give away too much. I don't want to go into every single detail of the society because I want to leave there room for you guys. But here are some quotes that I found very, very interesting. There is no final revolutions. Revolutions are infinite. A man is like a novel. Until the very last page, you don't know how it will end. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be worth reading. You're in a bad way. Apparently, you have developed a soul. Those two in paradise were given a choice: happiness without freedom, or freedom without happiness. There is no third alternative. Here I saw with my own eyes that laughter was the most terrible weapon. You can kill anything with laughter, even murder itself. Children are the only bold philosophers, and bold philosophers will always be children. So you're right, it's a children's question, just as it should be.